Today we're going to look at the Jimmy Carter administration. Now, Jimmy Carter is only going to serve one term, but we can divide his one term into two sections: before the Iranian problem and during the Iranian problem. The Republican convention was held in '76 in Kansas City. And there was a deadlock between the president, Gerald Ford. Remember, Gerald Ford had been a congressman from Ann Arbor before he had been appointed president of the United States, and Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was a former governor of the state of California. He had been a popular movie star and television actor, and when he had trouble getting gigs in the movies and TV, he turned to politics. He believed that our war in Vietnam was just. He was opposed to the anti-war demonstrators. He came down hard on hippies in the University of California system. There were a lot of Americans who saw Reagan as a true conservative. Well, we know that Ford got the nomination, and during the debates, many Americans expressed their anger with Ford for pardoning Richard Nixon. And in the end, they turned to Jimmy Carter. Now here's a much better map. You can see that both of them are relatively close in popular votes, although Carter does have 50%. And you can see in electoral college votes, it is a victory for Mr. Carter. Now, a lot of Democrats say that the only way a Democrat could be elected to the office of president is if they had the support of some of those southern states. And we're going to see this again with Clinton, and we're going to see this again with Obama. Jimmy Carter had started off being a naval officer. He quit when his father died. He returned home and became a farmer, a peanut farmer in Georgia. He ran for the governorship of Georgia and won. And Carter sold himself as an outsider to the American public. Carter inherited a mess from the Republican president, Ford. Carter felt the biggest problem was inflation. And when Congress would pass bills that spent money, Carter would veto them. Now remember, this is a Democratic president who is vetoing laws that have been submitted by a Democratic Congress. Congress, which is Democratic, will not support Carter. In many cases, they will override his veto. Unemployment continued to rise, inflation continued to rise, and the question was, are we ever going to get out of this mess? Now, we heard in the last lesson about the wars between Jordan, Syria, and Egypt versus Israel. And Israel has a lot of new land that had been Egyptian, land that had been Jordanian, land that had been Syrian. Many of the people who live in this land are opposed to what the Israelis are doing. There is a great deal of struggle. Now, President Ford believed that the way we could get out of this oil crisis was to go to alternate fuels. And the alternate fuel that was talked about the most was nuclear power. But the biggest question about nuclear power was, what would happen if there was ever an accident? Well, an accident occurred at 3 Mile Island in the state of Pennsylvania.
For many years, there has been a vigorous debate in this country about the safety of the nation's 72 nuclear energy power plants. That debate is likely to be intensified because of what happened early this morning at a nuclear power plant in Pennsylvania. Max?
Frank, it was an accident at the 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant, which is located on an island in the Susquehanna River, 10 miles from Harrisburg. A cooling pump broke down, and the plant did just what it was supposed to do, shut itself off. But not before some radioactivity had escaped. We have two reports. First, Bettina Gregory.
It happened at the number 2 generator about 4 o'clock this morning. Something caused the secondary cooling system to fail. It shut off the reactor, but heat and pressure built up and some radioactive steam escaped into the building housing the reactor and eventually out into the plant and the air. William Whittick lives across the river.
I heard a very loud noise that sounded like a huge release of steam, and I looked out the window. It was dark, but you could see from the lights over there that there was a geyser of steam that was raising up in the air.
Mike Janowski was working inside.
Didn't see anything, didn't hear anything. All you hear is the turbine trip, and down she comes, and they announce it, and away you go.
Workers were evacuated. The plant was completely shut down. A crew from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission rushed from Washington and sped around all day testing for radiation. Workers in their cars were checked and rechecked for radiation. Some was found. Late today in Washington, the NRC said, quote, "There's a hell of a lot of radiation in the reactor building," adding that radiation had penetrated the 4-foot-thick walls of that building and was detected as far as 1 mile away. Officials of Metropolitan Edison conceded some workers may have been contaminated, but they insisted this was not a serious accident. They said only 1/10 the amount of radiation needed for a general alarm escaped. Why then was a general alarm sounded and not until 3 hours later? Company officials said just to be safe, but state officials were upset that they weren't told of the accident earlier.
If there is a situation where there was a perception of an emergency and the Pennsylvania Emergency Management Agency and Council were not notified, we intend to find that out. That would be extremely disturbing. We will make a thorough investigation into that.
Officials say they still don't know what caused the malfunction that triggered the general alarm. They say the only thing they're certain of is this, that there'll be an investigation and that this nuclear power plant won't reopen until they're sure it's safe. Bettina Gregory, ABC News, 3 Mile Island near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania.
This is Roger Peterson. Most people have little knowledge of what goes on in a nuclear plant and couldn't care less until something goes wrong. Like most nuclear facilities, the one at 3 Mile Island is a pressurized water reactor. What that means is simply water under pressure is heated as it circulates through uranium-filled fuel rods. That water in turn heats another water system, turning it into steam to run turbines that generate electricity. Here's what nuclear experts believe happened in this system. The pump that circulates water through the steam generator in the turbines apparently failed. With the pump out, water couldn't circulate. Pressure built up until a relief valve blew on the turbines. That's where the radiation was released into the atmosphere, but well below any danger level. With that system down, there was no way to draw heat out of the cooling water that circulates through the reactor itself. Again, pressure built up until another relief valve was triggered, this time sending highly radioactive steam throughout the containment building. The loss of pressure in the cooling system automatically shut the reactor down. Inside the containment building, the radiation is reportedly being measured at from 50 Roentgens per hour at the base to 4,000 Roentgens per hour at the top. Anything above 600 is considered deadly. Some of that radiation is leaking out through the walls. The high levels inside the building indicate damage to the fuel rods in the core, and that deadly radiation will have to be cleaned up before any repairs can be made. Roger Peterson, ABC News.
This was also a time in world history in which many African countries are either wishing their independence or wishing that they could be stronger politically. Now, the Union of South Africa, one of the most populous countries in Africa, one of the richest countries in Africa, has what we call a type of government called apartheid. Apartheid is where the minority oversees the majority. Now, in this case, the minority are whites. The majority, who are blacks, feel that this is wrong. And many of them are going to speak out. Now, this is Nelson Mandela. He is one of the leaders of the South African cause. Nelson Mandela will speak out, be thrown in jail. As soon as he gets out of jail, he will speak out again. And it is during the Carter administration that Jimmy Carter is going to propose that the United States come down hard against apartheid. This is also a time when the United States is going to give the Panama Canal back to Panama. We had signed an agreement in 1901 that gave us a 99-year lease. But the Panamanians are upset. They believe they should get a bigger profit from the Panama Canal. Carter agrees, and Carter is going to propose, and Congress is going to agree, to give the Panama Canal back to Panama. Carter is going to continue the arms reduction started by Nixon and Ford. Now, the last time we looked at this, Mr. Nixon had signed SALT. Under this particular arrangement, Carter is going to further reduce the number of nuclear warheads, further reduce the number of missiles. This is what we call SALT II. Now, it is during this time, though, that the Soviet Union is going to invade Afghanistan. Now, the Afghan government is opposed to the Soviet government, and many of the Afghans are going over the mountains into the Soviet Union and trying to stir up those Muslims who live in extreme southern Soviet Union. The Soviet Union decides to invade Afghanistan. Now, although this is a problem, it is going to be a bigger problem for our next president. 1980, the Summer Olympics were supposed to be played in Moscow. Jimmy Carter is going to propose that the United States not participate in the 1980 Summer Olympics as a sign of our being upset with the invasion of Afghanistan.
The United States Olympic Committee voted to boycott the Summer Olympic Games in Moscow.
In 1979, Afghanistan was already reeling from a violent coup. The new communist leader, Hafizullah Amin, had plans to westernize the largely Muslim country and quickly became the target of a widespread effort to remove him from power. None of this sat well with the USSR or its powerful chairman, Leonid Brezhnev, who feared that the uncertainty in Afghanistan would diminish the Kremlin's influence in Central Asia. Soviet troops arrived on Christmas Eve of 1979 to back the counterinsurgency and dug in for war.
Soviet troops were all over the place in Afghanistan today.
The action was met with condemnation from all around the globe. U.S. President Jimmy Carter issued an ultimatum.
And I have notified the Olympic Committee that with Soviet invading forces in Afghanistan, neither the American people nor I will support sending an Olympic team to Moscow.
Brezhnev didn't back down, and the Moscow Games proceeded with the smallest turnout of any Olympics in decades. And while the boycott had widespread international support, many athletes bristled, feeling like the Olympics should transcend politics.
You can look anywhere around the globe and you'll find a problem where help is needed, where we could jump on a bandwagon, if you like. And I think it's just a little unfortunate that we've chosen now the Olympic Games to have a go at.
In response to that boycott, the USSR counter-boycotted the 1984 Olympics in Los Angeles. The country would eventually return to Olympic competition in 1988, but Soviet troops remained in Afghanistan until '89. Some estimates put the number of deaths during that conflict at nearly 2 million people.
It was during this time period that Carter is going to propose to the Israelis in the countries of Jordan, Syria, and Egypt that the only way they could survive was to have peace. Now, Carter proposed that the leader of Israel, Menachem Begin, he's the gentleman on the right, and Anwar Sadat, who is the leader of Egypt, he's the gentleman on the left, come to Camp David. Now, in Maryland, just a few miles outside of Washington, D.C., is Camp David, created by President Eisenhower, named by President Eisenhower's son, and it is a retreat for the president. The president can go there. There's no reporters. There's nobody taking pictures. And for almost 2 weeks, Carter is going to propose that the Egyptian leader and the Israeli leader come to some type of truce. Eventually, the two did. Now, we refer to this simply as Camp David Accords. The Camp David Accords are going to see Israel and Egypt recognizing each other as countries. Furthermore, there would be economic aid given to Israel and Egypt by the United States. Now, in time, under President Clinton, Israel and Jordan will come to an agreement. Now, so far, no agreement has ever been signed between Israel and Syria. Now, Menachem Begin, the gentleman on the right, is going to pay the ultimate price for this accord when he is assassinated by an Israeli person in Israel. And Anwar Sadat is going to be assassinated by an Egyptian. Both of the assassins said they did it because of this particular agreement. After Israel had taken over the lands following the Six-Day War, those Arabs who lived in the lands were terribly upset, and they decided that they were going to create terrorist actions anywhere they could against Israel. Now, here is a bus in which an Arab has entered the bus and then blown himself up with all the other people. Acts of terrorism are becoming more and more common from 1967 to the Camp David Accords and past that time. This here is probably the greatest act of terrorism that occurred in '72.
A masked gunman steps onto the balcony of 31 Connolly Street in Munich's Olympic Village. He knows the world is watching. Hundreds of TV cameras in place to cover the Olympic Games, now trained on this window. Inside, 2 Israeli athletes are dead. Another 9 Israelis held hostage by a group of Palestinian gunmen calling themselves Black September. A hastily established crisis team is trying to negotiate their release. The terrorists want hundreds of Palestinian prisoners released from Israeli jails. Nothing else will do.
Issa, the chief, told me more times, even when I asked again, don't try, I'm a soldier. I got an order, I have to fulfill that order. You offer us a window, and this window we have to use to show the situation of our people.
Security at the Games was minimal, and for reasons still unclear, officials also appeared to have ignored one of 26 possible terror scenarios, which specifically warned of a possible hostage-taking by Palestinian militants.
The lax security approach was deliberate. Authorities wanted to show a very different Olympics and a very different Germany from that of 1936, when Hitler had hosted the Games in Berlin. But this fear of appearing in any way militaristic had given rise to a police force that was completely ill-equipped and untrained to deal with terrorism.
The plan to pledge the terrorists safe exit, then kill them, went disastrously wrong. In a firefight at a nearby military airfield, the terrorists turned their guns on their hostages. Once the firing stopped, all 9 of the Israeli hostages, a German policeman, and 5 of the 8 terrorists were dead. Fencing coach Andrei Spitzer was killed that night. His wife Anki remembers visiting the flat in Connolly Street.
I went up and by myself, and then I stood there in the room, and the chaos was incredible because, you know, blood all over the place. They brought them food that they didn't eat, they didn't let them go to the bathroom. It was total chaos, and I just stood there, I looked and I said to myself, you know, if this is where they spend the last hours of their life, I'm going to talk about it. I have to tell about it.
Olympic dreams shattered in a very black September, when the face of international terrorism, now all too familiar, made its horrifying grand entrance onto the world's television screens. Diana Magnay, CNN, Berlin.
Now again, this is just one example of terrorism against Israel. There were many, many, many more. But Palestinians said that the Israelis gave as good as they got. Well, we are finished with today's work, and a reminder that you have until 11:59 tonight to get your work in. Good luck.